And for more, let's bring in our guest. Paul Waldman, he's an opinion writer at the Washington Post, and he recently wrote a piece called Republicans Have Declared War on Democracy Itself. And let me pick up from there, Paul, because there seems to be two schools of thought. And the more dominant one is, listen, the Republicans, they don't want to upset the president. They have to worry about the Georgia runoffs. Down deep, though, they know that it's a matter of when, not if. This is just delaying the inevitable. They don't want to upset Trump. But that presumes that the guardrail will kick in at some point here, and there won't be any attempts to undo in the Electoral College or whatever else what was a free and a fair election. Which camp do you find yourself in, that this is problematic, this is even dangerous, but there's an inevitability that can't be ended? Or are you worried that we still haven't seen the final act of this clown car?
Yeah, the problem is not that it will prevent the proper transfer of power or keep Joe Biden from assuming the presidency. But what really concerns me is the legitimacy of the entire system. And that's what Trump is telling his voters, and what Republicans are reinforcing is the idea that it is absolutely impossible for a Democratic win to be legitimate. And if a Democrat wins, that means there must have been fraud, there must have been cheating, and therefore you don't have to treat that president like he's a legitimate president and deserves any kind of respect or deference. And that's why I think that this is really, this voter fraud idea in 2020 is going to be to the Biden presidency what birtherism was to the Barack Obama presidency. It was a way for Republicans to say, he's not really the president. He doesn't deserve to be president. He's not legitimate. And therefore, you don't have to treat him with any kind of respect. And I think that it's even worse this time because, Trump has spent 4 years kind of tearing down the legitimacy of the system and telling people that they don't have to have any kind of real commitment to democracy, to the institutions of the American system, if they're not giving them the outcome that they want at any particular moment. And my real fear over the long term is that there are going to be people on the fringe, supporters of Trump, who look at what happened once Joe Biden becomes president, and they'll say, Trump was right. This whole thing is rigged. Ordinary politics can't get us what we want. It's not enough for us to just say, okay, we lost this time and we'll try to win next time. That we have to take some kind of extra political means of getting what we want. And that could even turn out to be violence.
Well, I can't tell you the amount of times, Paul, and I suspect I'm not alone in this, where 4 years ago, like many, I obviously didn't see the results coming as they did. But I had always had this abiding belief that the pillars of democracy, the checks and balances, everything that we learned in civics growing up, would prevent any one person from hijacking the norms that we knew. That, we had 3 separate branches here, they'd all play their part. Obviously, I couldn't have been more wrong. Do we need to use these next 4 years to reinforce those pillars? Did the founders, and we always talk about their brilliance, rightfully so, but did they have blind spots where if there wasn't someone so undisciplined, a person could actually do even more permanent damage than Trump if he or she was more strategic about it? Do we really need, under the next 4 years, to save the democracy from what might come down the line?
Yeah, and I think Trump provided us a real instruction of what the weaknesses in the system are, because we've been talking a lot about norms the last few years. And what we learned is that while there are rules, the system is also undergirded by a whole complex of norms that everyone up until now had agreed to. And even some of the rules that may not have an enforcement mechanism behind them, that means that they end up being rendered meaningless. So it never even occurred to us over the recent decades that you could have a president who would not only refuse to tell us where he's getting his money and release his tax returns, but who would also be actively using the presidency to enrich himself. It just didn't even occur to us that that could happen. So we didn't have strict rules set in place to prevent it. We may need to construct those rules. Or take another example, the Hatch Act, which says that you can't use the resources of the federal government for political purposes. Well, it turns out that people very seldom get prosecuted for it, and there are essentially, functionally, almost no penalties. And so, even though in previous administrations they would take care not to violate the Hatch Act, if you were in the White House and you wanted to do some fundraising, you'd have to leave the building. Well, the Trump administration just said, we don't care. And they violated again and again and again. And we saw Trump's convention, which took place in no small part from the White House, which is an absolute clear violation of the Hatch Act. It was illegal. But they just did it anyway because they knew that nobody was going to stop them. There was this incident where a report from the government, a government watchdog, said that Kellyanne Conway, one of Trump's closest advisors, had repeatedly violated the Hatch Act. When she was asked about it, she said, kind of with a sneer, "Talk to me when the jail sentence starts." And the idea was that she knows she's violating the law, but she just doesn't care because she knows she can get away with it. And so I think that we do have to have kind of a reevaluation. We have to have somebody has to sort of put all this, everything that's happened together and say, where do we need to actually have rules that enforce what used to be just norms that we assumed everyone would abide by? And where do the rules themselves that already exist need to be reinforced, perhaps with some real penalties behind them so that people can be held accountable if they violate them?
I'm curious where you come down on this, Paul. I hear from a lot of frustrated Democrats and up and down the spectrum from the moderate to the progressive end. And they said, I'm tired of Democrats fighting by one set of rules and Republicans another, obviously as evidenced with a recent Supreme Court nomination confirmation, but so many other things. And they openly want to, pack the court, add states, whatever the case may be. And for a guy who believes in norms, and I push back on that idea, conversely, if you don't have an arms race, you have to at least look at somebody else and say the fever will have broken. Do you have any reason to see, when you look at McConnell, who knows better, who's going along with this charade that we've seen since the election, dangerously so, with real consequences? Do you see the fever breaking? Or if this truly is the Trump party going forward, stop waiting for him to have a crisis of conscience?
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be any crisis of conscience. McConnell, his guiding rule has always been, what can I get away with and what are the costs? And he's very shrewd about understanding what he can get away with. And one of the things that he understands is that when the system doesn't seem to be working, it's the president who gets blamed, even if the responsibility lies elsewhere. So if you have gridlock in Congress, the people say, oh, Washington isn't working. They don't say, oh, the Republican Party is stopping Washington from working. And so McConnell has very deftly used that to his advantage. And I think he's going to continue to. And so there are times, we had this brief discussion about whether or not Democrats should get rid of the filibuster, whether they should expand the size of the Supreme Court. And as usually happens, you had a lot of people saying, oh, no, that would be terrible. It would be, two wrongs don't make a right. And Democrats, a lot of them sort of withdrew and say, well, we wouldn't really do that. But sometimes you actually need to violate a norm in order to enforce it. Because if one side knows that they can just keep getting away with it, then, things like the Merrick Garland nomination, and they know that they're not going to pay a price, then they'll just keep on doing it. And if Democrats say, if you do this, then we are going to retaliate in kind, that's going to be the only thing that will stay Republicans' hand. Now, it may end up being moot because unless Democrats win both of those Senate races in Georgia, Republicans are going to be in charge of the Senate. And we're going to see a whole new level of gridlock. I think it's entirely possible that if they keep control, not only will they not allow Joe Biden to fill any Supreme Court vacancies that happen to come up in the next 4 years, they may not allow him to fill any judgeships at all. And you might say, well, they would never go that far. But we've said that about Mitch McConnell and the Republicans over and over again. Well, they wouldn't do that. And then they end up doing it, and it looks to them like nothing but victory.
And we already know, I've heard Senator Manchin say just this week that, even if they win the Senate seats in Georgia, he'd be a no vote on giving statehood to Puerto Rico, to D.C., or to, as you said, expanding the court, et cetera. So the Democrats have already drawn their own line in the sand, it seems, regardless of the outcome in those runoffs. Finally, Newt Gingrich paid a price when he shut down the country, in effect, shut down the government with his contract. Do you think the sides have become so hardened? I mean, 70+ million people voted for Trump at the end of the day, that you don't foresee a place where we come to our senses. There was one of my kids said a line, I think it was right. This is why we can't have nice things. I mean, we can't even have an election that we can acknowledge the results of, even with nearly a 6 million vote margin, probably when we add it up at the end of the day. Do you see a light at the end of the tunnel here, or no?
I wish I could say that I did, but it's really hard. And polarization has all kinds of effects. One of them is that people don't really have a commitment to sort of abstract ideas about how government should work that that they believe are more important than whether their side wins. And that is true to a lot of extent of Democrats, but it's especially true to for Republicans. And especially since over the last 4 years, Trump has been telling them so incessantly that the only outcome that is legitimate is the one where we win. And you simply that devotion to the system is for suckers, just as he says that paying your taxes is for suckers. There was a moment, I think, in one of the debates where they were talking about whether people who are applying for asylum show up to their hearings, which the vast majority of them do, almost all of them. And Trump said only the immigrants with low IQs show up to their hearings. And that's sort of his approach, is that the rules are for suckers. And the more people on his side that believe that, the more dangerous it is for the system, and the harder it becomes to get back to at least some level where we can agree on what the rules are and how business should proceed, and then both sides can make their case for why their approach is the better one, and assume that when one party wins and they implement their agenda, that the other party will say, I may not like this, I may try to change it next time we're in power, but I'm not going to just decide that the whole system is necessarily unfair and illegitimate and it's all rigged against us.
Paul Waldman, thank you for a few minutes. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.